Thanks to everyone for coming out this Friday afternoon for this talk. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sadeq Bigdeli, who has been a member of the law faculty at SBU National University of Iran since 2017. Before that, he was a senior lecturer in law at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, where he taught international trade law, international law, administrative law, and jurisprudence. Last summer, we had the great fortune to have Professor Bigdeli at the Nathanson Center as a visiting fellow. In the past, I have worked with and known Professor Bigdeli at the IGLP, run out of Harvard Law School. While he was a professor in New Zealand in 2014, and at the peak of negotiations over Iran's nuclear deal, Dr. Bigdeli was invited by the government of Iran to help manage the process of the country's reintegration into the world economy. He resigned his position in 2016 and took up a position at SBU. He then led a nationwide research project to formulate Iran's first national trade policy document with a focus on industrial policy and environmental sustainability. Dr. Bigdeli holds an MA and a PhD in law from the University of Bern and an LLM from Harvard Law School. So thank you. Professor.
Thanks very much. So I don't think I need the microphone, so yeah. So hello everybody, thanks Professor Matthews and the Nathanson Center for inviting me and giving me the opportunity for this speak today. So I don't usually do this, but I've written down a lot of the things that I want to say towards the middle of my talk, because I don't want anything, unthought of to be thrown out of my mouth. And so some of the things that I'm going to discuss relates to my experience, and then I'll talk about how it relates to the topic of my talk today. So one of the key ideas that was floating in the Iranian policy circles in the aftermath of the so-called Iran nuclear deal was that the country needed urgently to build the strong and deep economic ties with as many trading partners as possible to make it economically costly, if not prohibitive, for other countries, mainly the US, to undo, if not withdraw from the deal. Okay, so there was even a provision in the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, that to the effect that in case sanctions are to be snapped back in place, none of the investments and the transactions that had been made legally during this time would be impacted by that effect, by that cause. So I presided over Iran's trade promotion organization as vice president at the time, when hundreds of trade missions from so many different countries came to Iran to reap the benefits of what a McKinsey report at the time called a trillion-dollar economy, the last gold mine of the world economy that in fact had a potential of almost tripling its GDP, the last one, because Iran has missed the last wave of globalization for good or bad reasons in the late 20th century. So there's a lot of untapped potential there. So I was asked to move along not only Iran's accession into the World Trade Organization, which is a long overdue project of 20 years of US consistent practice of expulsion and exclusion from international economic order, but also to negotiate more than dozens of free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, with Iran's trading partner, including not only the neighboring countries, but also the EU, Southeast Asia, and different Asian countries. So prominent among these projects was negotiating the first phase of the free trade agreement with the Euro-Asian Economic Union, which is centered in Moscow. The secretariat is in Moscow. It includes 4 Central Asian countries. So I did that. I also negotiated a PTA with Turkey, which I thought, like many other people in the business community in Iran, was very much one-sided. But what I did, I also tried my best not to implement the Economic Cooperation Organization there was a trade agreement at the ECO, Economic Cooperation Organization, which goes decades back in the Middle East and tries to integrate these countries. There are 10 countries, 5 of them are part of a trade agreement. Why I did that is it was because, again, this was very much one-sided, a unilateral tariff reduction on the part of Iran, as opposed to Turkey and Pakistan, who had done already a lot of that under WTO and their own regional trade agreements. So simply, what I'm trying to say here is that this is a very relevant context in which I want to put to you my main question and hypothesis, which is the question that occupied my mind and the minds of many people at the time was that whether negotiating all these deals that would enhance trade and promote investment into the country, or simply opening it up to Iran's lying isolated economy to the global economy, would bring about a long-standing peace and security, not only for the Iranian society, but also for the whole region and beyond. Okay, so the question was whether free trade would lead to less fear of war and more peace. So as you might have been able to tell from my short story, I'm a bit of a more sophisticated than just like a free trade optimist thinking that it's always better than the status quo to open up to trade without taking account of all sorts of factors. So for example, there will be losers for sure. I mean, everybody, even the most staunch believers of free trade, emphasize that. But more importantly, whether free trade for a resource-rich country like Iran or Saudi Arabia or Russia, some people might argue Canada as well, would create a pattern of exporting raw materials and importing, finished goods. Would stuck the country at the lower levels of what we call the global value chains. And so we call it the so-called Dutch disease. It's a pattern when it happens when a resource-rich country, basically the resource sectors of the country overshadows the other segments of the country in a way that it would not be able to grow other than its resource-based sectors and non-tradable sectors in the economy. So the problem with that is obviously a low-income trap that these countries find themselves in as a result of not having technology spillover effects to move on to the sectors of the future. The resource-based free trade also creates high levels of fluctuations, and we see a lot of that in the Middle East and Africa. And also it could lead to high employment because there's so many jobs you can create in the resource sectors anyway. So there was this study in 2017 done on the macro impact of Iran's accession to the WTO. This study, like many other similar studies conducted on other countries, shows that Iran's accession would not only lead to higher GDP growth and jobs in some sectors, but also lower greenhouse gas emissions, and because it would eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and so on and so forth. But this study and other similar studies, they never capture the dynamic and systemic impact of full indiscriminative trade liberalization. So they simply use the so-called general equilibrium models, such as the so-called CGE models, that by default are premised on efficiency gains from trade that are true and solid, but very static and premised on very restrictive assumptions. So they completely disregard the decisive role of technology and the technology effects of trade liberalization, which is most astute for resource-based economies like Iran and Venezuela. Speaking of Venezuela, there's this Venezuela economist from Harvard, who is from Venezuela, Professor Ricardo Hausman, who, along with other economists, such as Hidalgo from Chile, who's at MIT, Danny Rodrik, originally Turkish, from Harvard, they came up with this amazingly refreshing theory of economic complexity. They call it economic complexity. And they have mapped out this, what they call the product space. Now, this looks like a new growth theory. And obviously, I don't have the time or even the full knowledge, to go through the details of that. So in oversimplistic terms, what this theory explains is that the more complex the country becomes, the more sustainable its growth can be. So it's about complexity. It justifies and explains how countries have grown during the 150 years up until now. And complexity is defined as complex products are the products that are produced by countries let me put it this way. Complex products are products that are produced by the least number of countries. The least number of countries, so they have technology rent. We call it Schumpeterian rent as well. And product produced by other countries that produce complex products are also complex. So there might be the fact that not so many countries produce resources or oil, petroleum, some mining, for example, raw materials, for example, but these products are not complex products because they do not match the list of products that are produced by other countries that produce complex products. So it's a rotational model that comes up with a list of products like machinery, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals, for example, or electronics, for example, that are among the most complex products. If you produce these products, you can be expecting to have a sustainable growth, and for that you need to have this place in terms of your place in technology. You need to have a technology advantage because there's a lot of spillover effect that comes as a result of being able to produce a complex product. So this seems to be a serious limitation, if not an existential challenge, to the Smith-Ricardo theory of comparative advantage, according to which trade always creates win-win, even if it's done unilaterally, let alone bilateral or multilaterally. The textbook argument goes, if reciprocal trade liberalization is not an option, then countries will still be better off opening up unilaterally, getting rid of all tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade. So, regardless of the merits of that textbook argument, countries, as these graphs show, and you see here, so countries have increasingly resorted to protectionism and regionalism, that is going from an MFN, most favored nations, non-discrimination, which exists under the WTO rules, to reciprocal trading relations. So, this was also my main problem in Iran's accession file because it was pretty much a unilateral act. So in the process of accession of a country into the World Trade Organization, basically you're asked as an acceding country to unilaterally reduce your tariffs, but you don't get to negotiate bilaterally with other countries for them to get their tariffs on a lower level because they argue that they have done that sometime in the past, 80s, 90s, or what have you. So that's why I pushed for a dual strategy of WTO accession to signal the ending of Iran's economic isolation, but also concurrently with that, I pushed for regional and bilateral negotiations. So in this context, let's reformulate our main question here. How to think about regional integration in a way that could maximize what we can call the peace dividend, promoting peace and security as opposed to exacerbating it. So based on what I said, the easy answer would seem to be, according to liberal free trade economists, free trade might likely lead to more peace if the definitive gains from trade outweigh the adjustment costs or transition costs of getting people re-employed in the sectors in which the country has comparative advantage. Hausman, Ricardo, and others, maybe Stiglitz included as well, would not necessarily even, they might say that a blind liberalization project, as advocated by the so-called Washington Consensus, would not necessarily even lead to economic prosperity long term, let alone peace as a result of that. And yes, many people, even the liberals, have learned their lessons, that the so-called transition costs are often too high, having seen the rise of populism in the world, across the world, Brexit, and of course, Trumpism. So But as I learned from all of the above, the theories that I explained very, very briefly, I argue here today that despite all of its flaws, bad experiences, and misguided projects of global economic integration, we won't be able to succeed long term to promote peace and security without having some sort of a viable trade and economic mega project with a regional focus. So that might look very much like one of the grand post-World War II projects of Bretton Woods, or even the grand project of the EU integration after the Second World War. But bear with me. I understand that these models are under attack today, but my argument is a little bit different from that. So apart from the fact that neoliberalism of the late 20th century led to the globalization's outreach, for example, that is argued by many, such as Professor Rob Howes, that the GATT was a different beast than what became of the WTO later. My argument here is that we should not and cannot repeat what was done in the past and simply undo the 50 years of whatever trade liberalization, rules making, related institution, but try to learn from it in the context of the rise of regional integration projects. In other words, in a post-WTO world where most of the continuation of what could not have been achieved under the WTO multilateral trading rules and the demise of the Doha round, which is part of the demise of international law as a whole altogether, there might be the need for countries to look into, obviously, regional solutions, hopefully on the back of some sort of a GATT, loose multilateral trading rules that would give a lot of flexibility to countries to innovate at the regional level. The WTO could still play that function, I think, having the background multilateral flexibility rules. And one has to see whether it can survive two terms of Trump's presidency, but that is subject to for another time. So one should also be cognizant of the problem, especially smaller countries would face in a bilateral and regional context, of course, as they would not have been, they would be very vulnerable to big players, global players, or big regional players bullying them in a regional context, of course. But this might be partially remedies by the fact that countries can balance big players out, like positive and negative balancing act. For example, in this context, US versus China. So this might provide an opportunity for countries like the countries in the Middle East to play around with the way that they approach the big powers in the context of their regional negotiations. Okay, so in light of that, let's focus on the question, how to think about regional integration in a way that would maximize the peace dividend. Now, obviously, asking the right question is probably half the step towards solving it. So that's why I've been spending so much time asking and trying to put that question onto you. So I obviously won't have a lot of time to get into the bottom of that. But for the rest of my talk, and then I'll be away from my notes because now there's less risks involved in terms of what I was going to say. I will be very brief in terms of touching these three items. So first of all, trying to learn from the long debated theories, mostly international relations theories, in terms of trade and war, trade and conflict. What can we learn from that? Then we will shortly look at the US-China trade war, what has been going on, and what could that mean for the world, for these countries, for the rest of the world. And then a very, very short perspective from the Middle East. Now, so there has been very, very long, early, I think late 18th century, there was a French economist, Bastiat, who never said it, but he's famous for apparently saying it, that when goods do not cross borders, soldiers will. So it's a very classical liberal argument in favor of trade, that if you open up trade, it will decrease the chances of war. If you protect and close borders on goods and, do not engage in trade, then you will increase the chances of war. Now, liberals have always argued for, similar lines of argument that economic interdependence lowers the likelihood of war by increasing the value of trading over the alternative of aggression, right? So interdependent states would rather trade than invade. That's one argument. The other argument that the realists make, and they have been right in so many circumstances, including World War I, they argue that yes, in World War II, that argument could work because in the 30s there was Great Recession, trade collapsed almost, and then that was one of the reasons that led to the Second World War. So liberals might be right in that context, but in the context of World War I, for example, in 1914, 13-14, the level of trade was very high. It was Germany and Japan were doing well. So the realists dismissed the liberal argument, arguing that high interdependence increased rather than decrease the possibilities of war, and that is to ensure continued access to necessary materials and goods. This is what was very important for Germany at the time. Now, Professor Copeland has come up with this more convincing theory, which is called the theory of trade expectations. He basically says that the liberals and realists are both right and wrong. Levels of interdependence and expectations of future trade considered simultaneously, he argues that could lead to new predictions. So interdependence can foster peace, as liberals argue, but this will only be so when states expect that trade levels will be high into the foreseeable future. So it's not their actual level of trade, whether it's high or low, which would basically impact their decision-making as to whether they want to go to war or not. It's their expectations of trade, whether it will be decreasing or increasing into the future, which would be a very decisive factor as whether they want to go to war. So what he says is that if highly interdependent states expect that trade will be severely restricted, that is, if their expectations for future trade are low, then realists are likely to be right. The most highly dependent states will be the ones most likely to initiate war, for fear of losing the economic wealth that supports their long-term security. In short, high interdependence can either be peace-building or peace-inducing or war-inducing, depending on the expectations of future trade. Now, you can think of it in terms of US-China or whatever other context, whether that might be true. There's also a need to theorize this a little bit deeper in the context of international trade law and political economy, because it's much, much more complicated today in 21st century, when a trade war is not only about trading in goods, but also services, capital, data, technology, and a lot, monetary policies and all of that. So this looks convincing, and it explains World War I, World War II, and it looks convincing to me in the context of Iran as well. Because at the time of the nuclear deal, what happened was that we were at the verge of war, and it's been documented. Countries had been considering it, and the nuclear deal was signed. There was this expectation that as a result of the nuclear deal, we would be expecting to have higher trade. That very much substantially decreased the likelihood of war. And then with the nuclear deal, when President Trump last year, May 2018, withdrew from that, it increasingly enhanced the likelihood of war. And that's what we saw in the Persian Gulf, and so we have to see what happens. Now, in 2 weeks' time, President Rouhani of Iran is going to the General Assembly in New York, and there's this talk of maybe he will, make a picture with Trump and all that. But it has a very great impact, not only in terms of macro impact, but also in terms of the likelihood of war. So there is this. It's not about whether Iran and U.S. are very low in terms of not really trading much, but it's about what is going to happen in the future that will impact the decision-making of the key people in both countries. Now, there is a caveat, though, that this theory might not work all the time, because there has been instances, for example, with respect to China and India tensions, that despite of the fact that India and China had very low trade in 1949, 1954, there was a period of peace in that period. Now, in 1953, I think, 56, and later in that decade, they signed 3 free trade agreements, and trade started to rise in the 60s. But with the rise of trade, we also had the rise of tensions, which led to war, the famous Sino-Indian War. And then after that period, 1984, 2007, trade started to pick up again, but that sort of trade increased and enhanced stability. So how is that possible? There's a very recent paper that explains that increased expectations of trade might, in some circumstances, exacerbate informational asymmetries about the opponent's willingness to maintain peace. What that means in simple terms is this, that India was sort of gambling over the fact that China will never go to war. Why? Because trade was picking up. Everything was good. China would be crazy to go to war because things are really getting good and the trade is picking up. So India over-gambled, over-relied on that. It had information asymmetry. It didn't know, and basically it tested the resolve of China to go to war. And India didn't know that for China, economics and trade was important, but border issues was more important. So basically the rise of trade, resulted in India underestimating China's resolve, and that actually enhanced the chances of these countries going to war. So there's increasingly more understanding of what happens in terms of relationship between trade and war. Now, what that all means in terms of our current context of the global trade wars that are waged by President Trump, basically. So there are so many different episodes. I don't want to dwell on this, but there's the solar panel and washing machine episode. There is a 25% tariff by President Trump on these 2 products coming from, China and Korea. So that's one episode I don't want to get into. It's not so serious, but it was the beginning of one of the battles that were waged by President Trump. The other one is steel and aluminum. It has impacted Canada as well as so many other countries, China, EU, Canada, Mexico and all that. So it's a 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum. Now, what happens there is that it's a long story. To make it short, to get into the real troubles, basically, so Canada started to retaliate, other countries as well. Then Canada, Mexico, and US have retreated because they have negotiated this alternative NAFTA project, which is called the USMCA. But so other countries have retaliated as well. India also retaliated after the so-called, they have lost the so-called GSP or development country status with respect to these products. So that's the second battle. But the third and the most important battle that you always hear in the news, and it's on the news that the US economy might be going into recession in the next year or so. And a lot of people in Bloomberg and other places are talking about it, whether this will be, obviously this will be one of the factors contributing to it, is the unfair trade practices for technology, intellectual property. It started off as US threatened tariffs, to impose tariffs on China. That was early in, that was last year, April 2018. China threatens retaliation on auto, aircraft, agriculture. Then White House plans tariffs after beef hold. China revised retaliation risks. Then Trump finalizes a $200 billion tariff list. Before that, China had imposed a tariff, an additional tariff on $50 billion of Chinese imports. We had for a brief period of time a US-China tariff truce, which happened in early December last year. Then Trump renews tariff threats in May this year. US raised tariff rates on previous list, and China raised retaliatory tariffs. And US announced that by the end of the year, basically what will happen, and I have a graph to show that here, is that the US might impose 25% tariff flat on all 500 billion plus of imports from China. And China is also retaliating so far on $60 billion of imports from the US, but it's going up probably to the whole like 100 billion plus imports from the US. This graph shows that gradually from January 2018 to November 2019, the level of tariffs on each country, US and China, have been going up, and they will convert somewhere between 24-25%. So the US used to be a free trade country when it comes to manufacturing products. So on MFN basis, which is the WTO rate, US charged only 3-4% tariffs. Now on China alone, it will be imposing 25% tariffs, and China stood at 8%, and it will be 25% as well. But obviously, it's an imbalanced game. That's why, that's what Trump is playing into. It's a 1 to 5 kind of, the kind of trade deficit that US is running against China. So that's why everybody argues that in the short term and in the only purely economic sense, obviously China is hurting more than the US because China has this large market that is losing as opposed to the US. It's basically the game of numbers. Well, there's a battle for, I don't want to talk about, it's ongoing, but it's still on hold on autos, which President Trump considers a national security threat. And there's also illegal immigration from Mexico you all know about, but well, Trump wanted to impose tariffs on Mexico, which is on hold now because of the deal. So there's also this battle that nobody talks about in these terms, Iran sanctions, US sanctions against Iran. And there's a lot to be learned here. It's not only the toughest economic war ever waged in history in a country, but it also explains a lot of, it's like a laboratory if you don't think of it in terms of, the costs on humanity and societies and so on. But you can test a lot of these theories in that context. So what you see in this graph is Iran's GDP growth rate in 2010, 2011, and then it fell off in 2012 as a result of all of these UN sanctions and in addition to unilateral sanctions by the US and the EU. The GDP goes negative -5, -7, then -1. And as the nuclear deal is getting negotiated, this is where I went back to Iran from where I was in New Zealand, the GDP starts to pick up. In fact, at the implementation day when the sanctions are lifted in 2015. So the GDP was the highest in the world for that year, the GDP growth rate that was recorded for Iran. That went up to 13%. And it was good the next year until the US reinstated the sanctions. That was through President Trump's withdrawal from the deal. And this is exactly what happened. The currency plunged and lost 70% of its value. And obviously, the oil industry also fluctuates alongside with that because the US sanctions are one of the main sanctions are directly towards pushing other countries not to buy any oil from Iran. So that's why you see Iran was selling like something close to 4 million barrels a day. During the last period of sanctions, it went down to some 1 point something million barrels a day. Then it picked up again to close to 4. And then now today, there are different estimations, but it's around 300,000 has been told that Iran is only, practically selling in the black market. And it's also important, this story, in terms of how other countries could be dragged into this war. Obviously, you're all aware of the Huawei incident here in Canada, and that had to do directly with Iran sanctions, the fact that Huawei had violated US sanctions by selling telecom products to Iran. So it's still an ongoing tension and issue. So it's very important to track that. It's not only, so it's a web of sanctions and battles and economic tools that countries increasingly use in order to gain political or economic or what have you advantages. So as I explained, the expectation theory seems to be working here because alongside with what I explained here, what happened was that we got this height of showdown with Iran, if you will, where in June and May this year, we had almost a war. Iran took down practically, unheard of in the context of that region, took down a US drone, which it claimed to be in its territorial waters, and the US obviously claimed that it was in international waters. So President Trump famously said that I almost attacked Iran, but then I thought, well, so many people will get killed, so I reconsidered. Okay. Now, let's look at this in terms of a diagnosis, very, very short. It could be a subject of a very long discussion, the US-China trade war, of course. But from what's on the negotiating table, the US-China trade war is about trade imbalance, 5-1, IP theft, that is alleged by the US to be the case, and currency devaluation, subsidies, a lot of industrial subsidies, STEs, state trading enterprises, state-owned enterprises, all of that. But in terms of the long-term dynamics, it's about geo-economics. Two flag point projects that China is pursuing. One is One Belt, One Road. The other one, Made in China 2025, are the ones that are part of negotiations. Now, again, US and China are going to negotiate for the second or third time, and there's some sort of a truce. So increasingly, the US is putting pressure for China to get rid of these two projects in one way or another. And it's interesting that President Xi himself apparently is very much adamant that we have to keep different elements of these projects in place. Because the way that it works is that it shifts the geoeconomics of the region and of the world in the way that this is not simply about just a trade battle, who exports and who imports how much, but it's about the dominance in terms of technology, who is going to be the dominant technology leader in the world. And for a long period of time, China has been able to rise in terms of gaining dominance over technology. So it's argued that it's not only about trade, it's more important than trade, it's about technology. And the Council of Foreign Relations stated in 2018 that it's a real existential threat to the US technological leadership. So it's also about the role of the state in the economy, the traditional, liberal way of thinking of free trade and free market, although it's a myth, it doesn't work like that in China. It's a very different model that exists in China. It seems to be working, and so increasingly developing countries are turning to that model, and they must be crazy not to do that. I mean, it seems to be working, right? So it worked for East Asian countries like Taiwan, Korea to some extent, but for China, it's a miracle economy, and it did not happen as a result of hands-off, laissez-faire, free market economy, but a very active role that the state basically took in terms of economic intervention in the market. And so basically it's about the US not being able to play by the old 21st century rules that it on its own created. The WTO, basically by letting the China into the WTO, which happened in 2001, what happened was that the China took advantage of the rules and the flexibilities, and now it cannot work anymore because the rules are not in favor of the US. So the impacts in terms of GDP is being predicted to be like somewhere around 1 or 2% short term in the US GDP loss, but in China will be huge, 3, 4, 5% GDP loss. The impact in the US still not quite sensed in the stock market, and it's very interesting. There are different reasons for that, justifications for that. The US is mainly targeting intermediary products like machinery and all of that, and that means that the consumers, it's going to take time for consumers to feel the impact, and also for that to be translated in terms of GDP and growth. But anyway, in terms of the public opinion in the US is interesting because, as you see here, it's pretty much across party lines. So 72% of Republicans support Trump's trade war, while 71% of Democrats asked whether they support or oppose raising tariffs on products imported from China. 71% of Democrats oppose it. So in the coming election, it's going to be very much a partisan issue. And it's very interesting in China, as far as we know, we can learn about China, at least my limited knowledge. This has increasingly been reported to fuse nationalism in China, which might be a factor that might get underestimated, as we might argue in terms of the theories that I just explained, that it's not only trade in China that matters, whether we're going to lose all this trade and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in terms of the decision to, for example, go to some sort of a conflict in South Sea China or elsewhere, or Hong Kong or whatever. But it's not pure trade, whether it will expect it to be higher or lower, or what it means in terms of GDP, but what it means in terms of psychology of a nation, which is now having a reason to gather around the Communist Party and have this nationalistic. Everybody I'm heard in China, or so many people, are supporting China's retaliations against the US, despite of all of its costs that I just explained. It's also an OECD battle. OECD stands for Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, but it's basically the rich countries. So Europeans, basically Japan and other rich countries, they also have issues with China. It's not like they hate what Trump is doing. They hate, the liberals at least hate the way that Trump is waging the war on China and its impact on the global economy, which is slowing it down. But they all agree that they have to deal with China in one way or another, because so there's this Chinese issue of, they call it state intervention and subsidies and doing things that we don't know about. But what we know is that 2025 China wants to basically produce 70% of its products from the inside, domestic content, and have all of these technology of the future, automation, Industry 4, and what have you see in China 2025 plan. So, and the One Belt, One Road, I'll show a picture in a couple of slides, how China is going to eat up like 2/3 of the global economy in the way that they're spending the biggest infrastructure project in the global history. So these are the questions, whether the global value chains, where products like Apple are being produced in China, but also the chips somewhere in Korea and so many, like 15 countries, these are global value chains. Well, whether they will be regionalized or whether they will stay as they are, because this is very important. If Apple and American corporations, as a result of Trump, will pull out and go somewhere else and assemble their products or take out their factories, how would that impact the security situation that is intense with regard to that region or the world security for that matter? And this will have mixed implications, good or bad, for other countries. So just a couple of words on the Middle East and I'm done. The Middle East, what you see here, this is a map of WTO membership. So all the green countries are full members of the WTO, except for the yellow ones. The yellow ones are negotiating accessions. So Iran is obviously not only the biggest, the largest economy outside of the WTO, but pretty much the only significant economy outside of the system. Now, the interesting thing in this picture is that it sort of correlates with, if you look at International Crisis Group, they have a map of security concerns and tensions. It pretty much correlates with the tension areas on their map. where countries are not members of the WTO and there are all sorts of wars going on in these countries. So I don't want to make a story here, but it's interesting that maybe we can argue, and you can refute that, but maybe by leaving out these countries into isolation, not letting them in, we are kind of not resolving the issues that exist in this part of the world. Now look at some of these maps. We have Russia here and Eurasia. So this is the kind of integration that Russia is pursuing. It's mostly in the Eurasia region. Russia is a regional power. It's still obviously not a global power because economically it has a hard time to do that. There was a smart decision, obviously, by Medvedev at the time in 2012 to become a WTO member, not for economic reasons. They didn't win so much as a result of that. They didn't lose it as well. It's pretty much the status quo. But they became part of the global economic order in which they can interfere. So in the WTO, Russia is very active. But in terms of the regional integration project, it's pretty much in that part of the org that you see on the map. This is the Euro-Asian Economic Union. And there are projects with China, that is the Russia-China Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but there's a very little economic component to that because everybody is afraid of China, opening up to China. It will destroy all of your industries. It's so competitive, it's very scary. Turkey, as you see, is integrating into the European project, has a European Customs Union project. My problem at the time when I was negotiating with Turkey was that basically Turkey had this problem with the EU. It will turn to Iran to define a free trade agreement with Iran, but at the end of the day, it was basically pursuing its own project with the EU. And what you have to know is that if in a customs union where you're part of a customs union, you can't unilaterally negotiate or change your tariff rates. When the Turkish counterparts were negotiating, long before my time, was that they were reselling their tariffs that they had already charging in the EU context to the Iranian predecessors. So this is pretty much the EU integrated into, Turkey integrated in the EU, but also a little bit Iran, Pakistan, and Latin America. Interesting Turkey-Israel free trade agreement. I will explain that in my last slide. Israel itself, not so much in the region. Turkey is the only country with which Israel has very active free trading relations, and to some extent Pakistan, but Pakistan, not so much that they export, it's mainly some agricultural products and textile. Iran, so many countries Iran has been negotiating, but at the very, very superficial way. I've never been able to give any serious concessions to any trading partners in terms of really lowering protectionism or lowering tariffs, even in the most rent-seeking sectors that have dominated our economy, like the auto sectors. So it's a very, very much closed economy in terms of high tariff rates. Iran is number one, closed economy in terms of trade protectionism. But it signs all these deals that mean not much in terms of their implications with other countries. Saudi Arabia, the most important project for them is the GCC, which is Gulf Cooperation Council. They have formed a customs union with these other countries, mainly Qatar, Oman, Jordan, UAE, United Arab Emirates, and so Kuwait. But that is falling apart as well. So in the recent episode, in the regional tension that happened, you might have heard of or not, of the blockade of Qatar. So Qatar was a GCC member, free trade among the members and unified tariff policy, trade policy in the region. It all fell apart when Qatar took a different side in the war in Yemen. So it's all up for grabs. What about Iran, Saudi Arabia? So Saudi coalition is falling apart, as I said, in the GCC. Iran is increasingly people talking about the Shia crescent. Very controversial term, but what it means is a security term. It's basically Iran by having so much military influence in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq as a result of the war on Iraq, and now Yemen, and there's Shia population in Bahrain as well, majority Shia. So they are depicting this as a crescent, And the question frequently asked in Iran is whether this can be translated into economic terms, like whether this can form an economic bloc or not. It hasn't. And my idea is that it shouldn't, because we have to think definitely outside of sectarian policies, which are not broadly supported, at least at the rhetorical level in Iran. But obviously, there are some facts to be considered here. For example, Iraq and Iran, very much integrated, and economically, Iran, almost 20-25% of its exports goes to Iraq. So that's why US can never fully sanction Iran, because Iraq and Afghanistan and China together form more than 80% of Iran's export, non-oil exports. And non-oil exports cannot be sanctioned because it's all in the black market, and it's very difficult to trace, as opposed to oil that you can trace who sells and who buys. There are these refineries, and so obviously the US has been able to sanction them effectively. So that's why Mr. Bolton, probably one of the reasons he got fired from, as National Security Advisor of the US, because nothing was working in terms of Iran budging, and it wouldn't. According to any of these theories that I've been talking about, Iran wouldn't have a reason to budge by being put more, being under so much pressure, increasing pressure. That's not the way that would bring about peace. Now, what about the role of the US and China in the region? The US has only free trade agreements with only 3 countries. Obviously, Israel is the main trading partner of the US in the region, and there's also Bahrain and Oman. There's free trade agreement between these countries and the US. And China, although there are not so many free trade agreements between China and other countries in the Middle East, it's mostly in the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, other countries, Chile, but there are all sorts of non-traditional trade, sort of investment relations, energy relations going on between China and the Middle East. So what these numbers that we put together in our work shows that China is the main trading partner of literally all countries in the Middle East, number 1 trading partner, except for Israel, Qatar, and Bahrain. China is number 1. Now, Turkey is an interesting example. Turkey has the US as its major export destination, so there's a level of interdependence there. Turkey is also a member of the NATO and all that. But China is the major import destination of Turkey. So there's really this tight, what are called the negative balancing act, that Turkey is overall doing a good job in terms of dealing with US and China. China's export and import to the region stands as 5% and 7%, US 4% and 3%. What it means is that neither the US nor China have a really big share of their global exports in the region. It's not that they care so much because it's such a big region to trade with. It's mostly about energy, but it's not really about a large chunk of their exports that go to the Middle East. Oil, of course, plays a key role in US-China trade war. For example, China took off oil from its retaliation list. China was imposing a tariff on oil from the US, and it always plays the oil card when it comes to Iran. So Iran is desperate to sell oil, China buys it, and then goes to negotiate with the US, say, I'm buying Iranian oil despite of your sanctions, and obviously that gives bargaining power to China. So this is the security situation that we face here today. So when it comes to the US in the Middle East, the US kind of mode of trade aligns more with war, because we have all these imports of arms from the US into the Middle East. This is arms import in 2012, 2016, as opposed to the period before, and it's increasing. Iraq has increasingly imported more arms, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, multiple times, Qatar, UAE, Oman, and well, Iran has never bought arms from the US, but from Russia, but it's more or less remained the same, the amount of arms that is imported into Iran. And then you see here, with all these countries that trade with the US, almost all of them, there are tons of military bases, all surrounding the whole region surrounding Iran in case of, God forbid, an attack. So, as opposed to, as I said, so what I meant by that slide is that U.S. interest in the region is geopolitical, as opposed to the China's interest in the region, which is more geo-economic. So it's about how to get this infrastructure, big infrastructure project, which is the new Silk Road. Iran has always been part of the Silk Road, but this project, One Belt, One Road, covers so many countries. It covers literally 152 countries with existing level of trade of $3 trillion, half of world population, 40% of world GDP, and 70% of energy sources. So it's really literally eating up 2/3 of the world. It's very much not only giving way to Chinese exports into the region, but beyond the region into the European, Latin American and other markets. So that's why very recently we've heard that the Chinese, which were somewhat upset when the Iran nuclear deal was signed, not because of the deal, they were happy about the deal, but because the Iranians had turned to the Europeans and the Americans to make deals, and they had somehow forgot about their old allies, the Chinese. Now there's a reunion between the Chinese and Russians. For example, recently China has pledged $400 billion. I don't believe that's a real literal figure, but something, maybe it's 150, to develop Iran's energy, transport, and manufacturing sectors. So this is a huge investment in Iran, which is not to help Iran grow necessarily, but it's part of a bigger project, which is what I call the One Belt, One Road project, and it has very huge long-term effect. The same with Russia. So as my last slide, I want you to consider as case studies that have never been looked into this way, that how, as I said, trade can help and has helped bring about peace, creating peace dividend in episodes of time in the Middle East in the past. So for example, case one, in an episode between Turkey and Russia, when Turkey inadvertently or whatever took down a Russian jet, really what helped there, and I was there at the time, was trade, how trade eased the relations between Russia and Turkey. It might be controversial, but I argue that was one of the factors. There's a lot of Turkish exports into the Russian markets, and Russia immediately put sanctions on Turkish imports, and then Turkey has this very pragmatic approach to trade. When it comes to trade, as opposed to geopolitical reasons, there's a lot of rhetoric, but in negotiations, they are very pragmatic, and they always put economic interests at the top of their demand list. Number two is Iran-Turkey. There's a divergence of interest sometimes, for example, in Syria, but trade has always softened up their positions, especially in oil, gold, and sanctions. Turkey helping Iran sometimes bypassing sanctions. The third case is Iran-UAE. UAE and Saudi Arabia are the two most important countries that waged the war in Yemen, that killed hundreds and hundreds of people and whatever, kids and children and all that. And UAE is staunch, whatever Saudi would do, the UAE would follow. It's a very, very close coalition between the two countries. But recently, EU has started to open up its hub, which Dubai has always been a hub for Iranian exports, and going through, a money transfer, financial transfer, which shows that there's always an interest there or relationship that people make between trade and war, and we'll have to see what happens on that front, but there has been very positive developments on that front, resulting in lowering the hostilities. WTO membership of Saudi Arabia might be argued to soften or contributed to softening the Israel-Saudi relations. Turkey-Israel, they had their own thing when the Israeli army killed 10 people in the famous Mavi Marmara ship. But they had this 1997 FTA, which was suspended in 2010 after that incident. But again, after 2017, talks started again. And it's always been a very important, there's a lot of volumes of trade between Israel and Turkey, and there's a lot of interest to think about there. Both negative and positive, as I said. Expectations theory is more nuanced than just a liberal idea of trade leading to peace. Iran, Egypt, it's a very interesting case where Iran exports a lot of materials to Egypt without having any political relations. So there's a potential there. And finally, Iran, Russia, EA-EU, Israel. I just want to put it very vaguely that Israel is signed a FTA with EA-EU, Russia, Eurasia. Iran has done the same. And the question is whether, with all the problems that in the Middle East are stemming from the fact that Iran and Israel have all these tensions, whether Russia can play a softening role there, being the market for both products coming into Russia from these two countries in FTA. It's just a question to be asked. And of course, it's not always like that. So there's the GCC, as I said, Qatar blockade, the trade couldn't help there. Russia, Georgia, trade couldn't help there. Or India, Pakistan, they have SAFTA agreement, but trade couldn't help there. So my concluding remark, back in 2014, when I was lying back on the shores of the Pacific, North Island, New Zealand, and thinking about whether it would be a sensible thing for me and my family to do to return to my home country, in such capacity as I explained, with all the risks involved. Was I so naive to think that the moment had come for my country after so many years to change, or haven't seen the Arab Springs turned into an illusion, all of that? Could I be so naive? So I never really, obviously, predicted Trump and any of the things happening in the last 2 or 3 years, but I was always thinking that, I was thinking at the moment that Iran stood at this historic crossroad where it has a chance we never thought it would in years to come. So it might not work this time, I was thinking at the time, but the moment of something, the moment of change, I thought it would come at a certain point, one way or another. And if it comes, and I think it will come, are we ready to put on the table something like a plan that is an alternative project that could work better in practice than the current existing neoliberal, neocolonial projects that has turned the Middle East into the mess that we are in? So sort of what we can call it tentatively a West and Central Asian project of multi-layered economic integration or what have you. But it's certainly a function of, I think, academia to think about that so that whenever the time is right, and I think it will come the time that countries get together and think about it, whether we have a plan. And I don't think we do, other than the old plan that exists on the table. So we have to work on that. And thank you very much for coming here today on a Friday afternoon. Thanks.